and hello once again. Welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. I'm your host, Michael Hingson, or you can call me Mike. It's okay. I hate to do the joke, just not late for dinner. But anyway, here we are. And today we get to talk with Barbara Anne Gardenhire-Mills. Barbara Anne is in New Jersey, has an interesting story and things that she's doing as a coach and other work that she is doing. And also, I'm going to give it away and she'll talk about it anyway. Barbara has had a couple of bouts with COVID and actually just got through with one, but she has a lot of wisdom about long COVID. And actually already in just talking with her before we started this, I learned some things I didn't know. And knowledge is always a useful thing to have. So Barbara Anne, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thank you so much. I am super happy and honored to be asked to be your guest today. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, then we ought to have one, right?
We should.
So tell me about maybe the younger Barbara Anne growing up and all that. Let's start there. It's always good, as they say, to start at the beginning somewhere.
Yes, to start at the beginning. So younger Barbara Anne was born in the late 60s to Marilyn and Joseph, a biracial couple. So when my parents got married, it still wasn't even legal in some states. And I was born right here in New Jersey, Jersey girl my whole life. And my 5'3" Caucasian mom and my 6'3" Black dad, African American.
Oh, good grief.
Yeah, they met when they were in college. And well, my mother's family was very, very not in any way, any color in the family tree, as recently proved by 123andMe. My father's family was always very integrated. And I was the first of 4 children. My mother and dad had me and my sister exactly 16 months apart on purpose. I think that's insane. I can't even imagine doing that these days.
Planning.
And then there was 3 other siblings that would come along the way, one of whom died shortly after birth because of complications. And it was interesting. I grew up in an apartment complex that wasn't then, but is now officially designated as what you would call affordable housing in a small little, I never thought of it as rural growing up, but they called it rural. It was Vineland, New Jersey. And it actually is the biggest city in the state of New Jersey in terms of land size, all 69 square miles of it. And but definitely in southern New Jersey, and this is at a time when a lot of the highways and systems that exist now didn't even exist in parts of South Jersey. And it was like its own whole other world. Anybody who has any familiarity with North and South Jersey knows how vastly different the two are, right down to the accents. And, we, had a good upbringing. Things were going well. When it was time for me to go to school, because of the time that it was you're talking about early 70s, I was bused as part of a program to make sure that they were, equally distributing children of color throughout the schools, which was really interesting when back in the days before there was cell phones. In fact, my parents had a party line. They accidentally put me on the wrong bus. That was fun when you're in kindergarten.
Ooh.
Yeah. But probably one of the earliest tragic things that would happen to me would happen when I was 7. And it's interesting because my mom said I've always been a forward planner. I've always been very rational, but also very even-tempered. And she likes to tell stories about how, at a time when I was 14 months, I spilled a bowl of popcorn and I sat there at 14 months old, individually picking up each piece of kernel of corn and putting it back in the bowl. And when I was, I started walking at 9 months, and around 11, 12 months, we were out walking and I saw a dandelion and I bent over and I pulled it up. I had no idea that I would kill it. I picked it up and I sniffed it and proceeded to put it right back in its exact place where it was. And so all these years later, she still loves to tell that story because I was very methodical and particular and had my routines and my processes. And then 10 days before Christmas, just after my 7th birthday, my father was killed in a car accident.
Oh.
And here was my mother at the age of 28, widowed, with 4 biracial children, the oldest of whom was 7, and the youngest of whom was only had just been born on October 27th. And that would be one of many pivots in terms of that would define my future going forward.
How did your your grandparents deal with you? Maybe at the beginning you said that they, on your mom's side, were not really oriented toward having biracial or any color in the family. Did that mollify at all, especially towards you as you grew older?
Not till I was much older. In fact, when my dad died, my grandfather, who was an Episcopal priest, refused to let my grandmother even come be with my mother, her grieving daughter, because as far as he was concerned, she was dead to him.
I have just never comprehended. Of course, I've been blind my whole life, and I regard it as a blessing, but I have just never understood this whole issue of color and skin color having any significance to anything. It's just crazy.
Well, for the most part, it wasn't even a thing until the mid 1800s. In terms of, I can't think of his name right now because I'm coming off of my long COVID relapse, but a British scientist was the one who kind of artificially constructed and classified race.
Yeah.
And there were a number of people, including Alexander Graham Bell, who bought into some of those theories.
Yeah.
And but before that, it really was just more of a familial designation in terms of what country you were from, and royalty was royalty. So they intermixed all the time. There was how we understand things now really are an artificial construct, which is one of the foundational pieces of what I do in my work as it relates to civility, inclusion, and equity and diversity. But in that time, my grandmother didn't come, my aunt didn't come, they were in Florida. My dad's family, my dad was the youngest of 6, and he was a sports person. He had played for the Eagles farm team, and he played basketball, and everybody knew who he was. And his family stepped up and stepped in, but her family was non-existent. I would finally meet her sister a few years after that, and we have a good relationship. I only ever met my one uncle on her side once, and I have a necklace that's handed down. So my mother was, her maiden name was Attlee, as in former Prime Minister Attlee of England. And so they were very particular. He was very much, interestingly, it was almost bad that he married my grandmother. He was very much your white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male who married my mother's mother, my grandmother, incredibly beautiful woman. Her name was Ruth Fogarty, and like parents off the boat Irish. Her dad was an Irish cop in New Orleans, and they had 3 children, and my mother was the oldest of them. And so dad wasn't so thrilled, and dad ruled the household. And I finally met my grandmother right before I turned 12, because there's a family necklace that's handed down through the Fogarty family line to the oldest female on their 12th birthday. And so she was permitted to come see us and transfer that to me. And then right around the time I turned 16, my grandfather decided to have a change of heart and that he was wrong. And I would meet him a couple of times between 16 and 19. And then when I was 19, he passed, which was very awkward. I agreed to go to the funeral for my mother. But that was probably actually one of the biggest fights we ever had too, because I had very strong feelings about being forced to go and mourn someone that had done what I now understood had been the things that he had done over the course of her life and mine. But she's an incredible person. So my mother, who everybody will know who it is, but I don't like, she tends to be much more private. She watches everything I do, but I don't usually name her for her own privacy reasons. She would raise all four of us on her own. She never remarried. She went back to school because she had dropped out when she married my dad, and then had me, she got married in February of 67. They had me in November of 68. So she decided to go back to school. She completed her associates, then her bachelor's, then her master's, and she went on to teach at the college where she got her nursing degree, and all of that joined the military before age 40 to become a nurse for the U.S. Army Reserve Corps. So she did a lot of really amazing things on her own, with me helping out along the way as the oldest child. So I learned to do a lot of things very young that probably wouldn't really be able to do now, in terms of watching siblings and cooking and cleaning and things like that, but things that were otherwise really common at the time. And another big part of our lives was the church that we were raised in. And because the whole family, my dad's family, was involved, well, both sides of my family were involved in the clergy, but the brother and cousins that we were most close to went to the church where we went to. And so they became a huge support system for my mom, and a very interesting indoctrination process for me that I would spend the better part of my teens and early 20s trying to undo. So that's the very early. We went to a private Christian school on scholarship. Then when my mom graduated, they said no more scholarships. So I went to public high school and did really well. But felt like I had been kind of thrown into this weird alternative universe where I had been used to being one of the only children of color in an entire school. And now I was in a school that was pseudo-integrated. Different kids tended to be tracked based on their intelligence, but also in part based on their socioeconomic status and race. And on my very first day, when I went to go in with the few kids that I did know into the school cafeteria, I was stopped at the door and I was told that only the white kids ate in there. I had to go to the other cafeteria with the Black and Spanish kids. And I was like, what are you talking about? And they were like, you can't eat in here. And that was not something that my high school fixed for almost another 15 years, when they finally decided to assign cafeterias and eliminate a lot of staff. But other than that, I did choir, I did drama, I did all the things that I loved to learn. Had some really great friends, and then couldn't afford to go to college. Now that my mom was working, I didn't get enough aid, and I had wanted to be a doctor. And so I ended up getting just enough grants to go to community college. And then I went to work full time and then went to school full time at night. I went to work for Prudential Insurance Company, and they paid 90% tuition reimbursement. And I worked there in policyholder services, answering questions for agents for 10 states. Here I was, at the ages of, 18, 19, 20. answering complex insurance questions back when everything was in these little books. We would have to pull the pages out and to replace them, to update them. We covered all of New England, and most of the East Coast, with the exception of New Jersey and Massachusetts. And I finished school. Go ahead.
So this was like 1987, 88.
Yes, exactly. Okay. 87, 88, 89. And then one of the next major pivotal things in my life happened. Having been raised in a very fundamentalist religion, I had never been involved in any kind of a sexual relationship, and I got raped. Mm. And what was interesting about it, other than the fact that it was pretty bad and it was somebody I knew, I got angry. And that pivoted me into advocacy. And I became a speaker. I spoke on college campuses. I spoke at my old high school. I was like, oh, no. This is never going to happen to another woman. Right.
Yeah.
This is just not okay. And then this whole world of advocacy opened up for me. And it's funny, I'll never forget, I ended up changing my major because my political science class in my sophomore year of college, the professor had us put a list of all of these different characteristics. He said, well, what describes a typical politician? And he was what in New Jersey we now call commissioners, but back then we called them freeholders.
Yeah.
Freeholders held land. And we put all these characteristics on a board of what a typical politician is. And he said, turned to the class, he said, okay, everybody, if you aren't at least almost all of them, if not all of these, you never, ever, ever have a chance of holding any kind of high office or elected office in government. And I looked at him in my stereotypical defiant way when somebody says I can't do something, and said, oh, really? And I changed my major to political science that week. And I would later tell him, after I graduated from political science honors from what is now Rowan University, with concentrations in pre-law and women's studies, I would eventually go back and tell him that he was the reason why I changed my major. And he was just so blown away. He's like, oh, wow, I'm so honored. Never really told him why. And guess what? Like many politicians, he ended up having an affair with a staffer and losing his seat and his wife in the process. So I guess he was so much more like far too many politicians back then than what was listed on the board.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Mm-hmm. I finished, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say when I finished college, though, my first job right out of college, as I had left Prudential to go back full time to finish, which was good because by the time I got done, Prudential no longer existed. They had moved their offices to Jacksonville. They didn't have the office that I would have worked at had I stayed there, like so many people said I should. Of course, they told me you really shouldn't leave this great job. And I said, okay, really? Well, watch me. And so I get out, I enter an ad in the newspaper, and I end up going to work for the city of Bridgeton in my field, actually working for the city in a new role called the Community Development Block Grant Subrecipient Monitor. And my job was to create the infrastructure for monitoring funds from community development block grants that were distributed to organizations in the community and a whole host of other things. And that was the beginning in 1992 of my 31-year career, other than one brief 6-year return to insurance after having my son, my otherwise 31-year career in community and economic development.
So you got married along the way?
I did, but not yet. I stayed single for a while. Yeah. Which was a really great question. I I just wasn't ready.
Yeah, I can
I
understand
was
that.
I was in this weird world of, I was too white for most Black boys. I was too dark for most white boys. I was not Latina, but that was what I was most often mistaken for because of my skin tone and where I grew up. And I was often just a novelty. Somebody wanted to be able to say that they had tried being with a Black girl. And in 2020, when I was 23 years old, that culminated actually in a second, much more serious rape scenario with a guy that I had been seeing who knew about the first one. We'd had conversations about the fact that his sister had been through something similar. And then myself and a friend went to a party at his house, and I didn't even drink because I didn't want to be in that situation. And yet I felt like I was drunk, and we didn't talk about things like being date rape drugs and things like that. But yeah, it was bad. And I remember bits and pieces, and they were just kind of joking that they all wanted to know what it was like to be with a Black girl. And so I was very protective of myself in many ways for many years. And when I met my husband, I was long distance seeing someone. He was seeing somebody else. We could care less. And then we would be reintroduced a couple years later. And I was at a point where I was like, I'm just not, I can't get involved with, I've had all these bad experiences with white guys and Black guys. I was seeing a guy from Puerto Rico at the time. And as my husband likes to say, he just had to convince me that he was the only thing missing from my life. So he did what every other guy who wants to be with somebody does. He became a really good friend. And then we would end up finally getting married 3 years after our first date, which was a disaster, by the way, because our first date was literally the day of the very first Million Man March.
Oh.
And I said to him, what were you thinking? We had ended up getting into a political conversation and realized we were about as diametrically opposed as one could be. And I asked him what he thought about, what was he thinking when he asked out a young Black urban professional. He said he didn't know because he didn't realize I was Black. He thought I was Latina. And then one of the jokes of that evening that still gets repeated to this day, I said, oh, and I suppose you haven't marched I suppose you've marched in a militia too. And he says, well, not lately. Now he had been in the North on a Civil War reenactment militia, but my husband would really appreciate your sense of humor. So somehow, in spite of that disastrous first date, next month we will have been married for 25 years and together for 28.
There you go.
And he was so everything I was not looking for at the time, which is probably exactly why it worked, because after all of those other experiences, I had decided I'm out. And so we got married. And in fact, I was executive director of a nonprofit housing organization at the time, and it was celebrating its 25th anniversary. So we postponed talk about an understanding guy. He's always supported me and said, you go be you. We actually postponed our honeymoon so that we could get the anniversary banquet and celebration out of the way and then go on our honeymoon without having that hang over our heads. So he knew what kind of person he was getting together with. And he was fine with that. And so, yeah. And we would go on and we would have one son. And that was another pivot. Here I was at this point, I'm now running an organization that the nonprofit that I was with helped start. I'm used to like going around the country and conducting training classes in housing counseling and homeownership education for housing counselors for the federal government. And I'm going all these great places. And then along comes this son who God purposefully gave me to prove I have absolutely no control over anything. And I remember, oh my gosh, it was something else. And I remember, and of course, being a slightly older mom at this point, I'm 33, having a geriatric pregnancy just didn't sound right. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm sitting there in tears one day. I'm like, how is it that I could testify in front of the state legislature and in congressional hearings, and I can't get this kid to go to sleep? What is wrong with me? But we got through it. I went back to the insurance industry, took a pause. 9/11 happened. I remember you. I remember seeing interviews with you on Larry King.
Mm.
And, one of the reasons why we chose our son's name, Colin, which is the original Greek word for courage, was after that happened, because we had, as you probably, I know you can relate based on having heard your story. I worked in Trenton, and so there were a lot of people would commute by train.
Mm-hmm.
So someone I grew up with was lost. A very, very close friend of ours, his cousin was lost. But then there were other people that were actually supposed to be there that I was friends with for various reasons, that like interviews were canceled. A friend of mine who worked in Jersey City was supposed to cross over he worked for Wall Street Journal, and he was supposed to be there that morning. It got postponed to that afternoon. So many people that had so many close brushes. And so Colin seemed like a really good name. And, but it also drastically affected our funding as a nonprofit, because all the organizations where we were basically redirected already committed funds to World Trade Center efforts. Yeah, which is why to this day, I'm still firmly believe in cash accounting and not accrual accounting. And I went back into the insurance industry for 6 years. And it was fun. And I was underwriting manager for a company here in New Jersey. And then we unmerged with our parent company, merged with another company, and a whole bunch of changes started happening. And I ended up going through my next major pivot. I decided to leave a role where I was having a lot of difficulty with someone who was actively sabotaging my work. And so I decided to take a lateral move, left a team of 19, several of whom were in extreme tears, to help go create another department. And that behavior continued. Constant, what we would now call bullying, but there was no such thing as bullying in the workplace.
Yeah, right.
And that would culminate in him physically assaulting me on the job in a conference room full of leaders in front of witnesses. And he herniated all the discs in my neck. And what was really interesting about that is all of the other things that I had been through, they were emotional and it was easy to recover. But the physical injury that for a while, my neck got, everything swelled up so much I couldn't walk, I couldn't feel my feet, I couldn't function. It was incredibly painful. All of my C-spine discs were either damaged or bulged. And you would think with so many people having witnessed it, it would be a no-brainer. He would get fired. That's not what happened.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Yeah. That's not what happened at all. I would later find out through notes that he was giving a one-time final warning, but this person had had a history of inappropriate behavior, and everybody would just chalk it up as to being that person. And so he had been there 20 years. I had been there 3, and they decided that I was the one that needed to go. And they did what we used to call in insurance terms and in other corporate terms called circle the wagons, protect their jobs. And that got ugly, very, very ugly. And Lisa Hillerin was my hero. She had taken the job, was supposed to be a director, was downgraded to a manager, which then downgraded me from management to consultant. And so she had only been there 6 months when this happened. She had transferred from another office, and in full integrity, she stood by me. Even when she personally was threatened, she stood by me. At one point, she was told by the vice president, "I'm trying to save our jobs. You need to get in line." And she said, "I would rather lose my job and be able to sleep at night than do what you're asking me to do." And fortunately for me, even though that left me permanently, partially disabled, I was able to find specialists. They did pay for one disc to be replaced. New Jersey has binding arbitration, and the company pays for it. So there's not really much of an incentive for a binding arbitrator to actually rule in the favor of an employee. And they had argued in court that assaults were not considered eligible for arbitration, but then tried to argue in arbitration that assaults belonged in court. And the judge saw right through it and sent them all and joined everybody together in binding arbitration. And what was interesting is they lost.
Wow.
And they lost. And what the ruling basically was that the assault aside, the way I was treated, including having ignored blatantly and openly admitted to ignoring their own grievance procedures process, that they had made a bad situation worse. And the funny thing is, they filed an appeal, at which point the arbitrator scathingly said, "What part of binding arbitration didn't you understand when you asked for binding arbitration?" And they would eventually shut down all New Jersey operations. There's lots of rumors, I won't speculate, but
Yeah.
almost everybody lost their jobs, all the way up to the top, including the New Jersey president. And I went back into government and nonprofit work, and that's where I've been ever since.
It's the insurance industry is a fascinating place.
Mhm.
The reason I said early on that you joined in the insurance world in 1987, 1988, something like 7 years before, around 1980, maybe 1979, but probably 1980, somebody in the National Federation of the Blind, which is the largest consumer organization of blind people, was at a meeting of insurance people and sitting next to a person from Prudential and said to this person, I think it also had to do with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, but anyway, said, insurance companies won't provide life insurance for people who are blind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this guy said, yeah. And the person who I knew said, well, don't you do everything that you do based on evidence, the actuarial statistics and evidentiary data, and you have mathematical models for everything? And the guy said, well, absolutely. That's how we make all of our decisions. And my friend said, well, can we see the evidence that says that blind people are a higher risk? And the guy said, sure, no problem. 6 months went by without any indication that there was anything. And finally, my friend said, so where's the evidence? And the guy from Prudential said, well, we're working on it. We haven't found it yet, but it's there. And my friend said, "You don't have any, do you? You have been discriminating against blind people and other persons with disabilities as it eventually expanded, but you've been doing that simply based on prejudice and a mistaken belief that we're a higher risk without any evidence to show for it. And on the other end, we as blind people know we're not a higher risk." Well, what that eventually led to was a campaign in every state in the union. At the time, I was living in Massachusetts, so I ran the effort for the state of Massachusetts, for the National Federation of Blind of Massachusetts, but to get every state to pass a law that said you can't discriminate against blind or other persons with physical disabilities unless you can provide actuarial statistics or evidentiary data. And to this day, of course, no one's been able to, because it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It wasn't scientific at all. It was prejudice.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know? Absolutely. And my husband had worked in that industry for a while. And and it both in the life insurance, but also in health and also in property and casualty, to be honest. At one point in 95 and 96, I had gone back to insurance company because I was recruited from a nonprofit specifically to help with a pilot program where they were re-entering the urban environment to because they had stopped insuring in most cities, urban environments, because of flat roofs and the fire risk that they had. And my boss, an amazing person, his name was Andre Howe, had conceived of this idea that if we worked with people to help mitigate risk, we think that they'll actually perform well. And he was right. And we worked in a very specific targeted neighborhood of Philadelphia and offered like free inspections and all kinds of things. And part of my job was to track the performance of that. Now, this was for Allstate at the time, and I will name them because at that time they had lost more money in Hurricane Andrew than they had made in the history of the company.
Yeah.
And this is a program that they would eventually roll out across all the states. And I had been serving on the National Insurance Task Force, which dealt with access, availability, and affordability of insurance in regional or in metropolitan as well as rural areas, because there's a big issue in rural areas too. But interestingly, a division of theirs decided not long after I got there that they were going to start mass canceling and non-renewing policies in the state of New Jersey. And the actuarial logic behind it was they looked at all of the people who had not an accident. Apparently, you get an accident every 5 years. They looked at all the people who had not had an accident within a 5-year period, determined that they were due, and decided that they were going to use a loophole in what was called the 2-for-1 law. For every 2 that you non-renewed, you could take 1 new customer. And they just started, guess what group hasn't had a car accident within a 5-year time frame? Disabled people, seniors, and those who only use vehicles for pleasure use. So here I was in the government relations divisions of a company whose state subsidiary was mass non-renewing disabled and non-working individuals. We had agents that were losing clients at like 90 a week. And of course, those individuals were taking all their business with them. And this was on the heels of them having gotten in trouble because somebody had made a very inappropriate comment about why they wouldn't cover repairs to a property for a same-sex couple. So it was a rough period for them that they would eventually overcome. But really, just that was some of the eye-opening for me in terms of why my advocacy needed to be so much broader than just around women.
So is that what sort of really led you into dealing with the whole issue of inclusion and equity and so on?
Yes, because at this point I had worked in Bridgeton, I had worked in Cherry Hill Township, I had worked in Camden, I had worked in Philadelphia. I'm looking at all of this, I'm seeing all this happening. I'm looking at people use numbers in ways that they should never have to use them because they had their own proprietary insurance score. And I had to know that model. So I had to know what went into it so I could teach it. And I realized that the problem was so much bigger than even the different things that I had in my life that were intersectional in terms of being a female, being a woman of color. I wasn't even dealing with the disability yet at that point. And, but just other things. And hearing the way people would talk about people as groups instead of as individual human beings.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It's amazing just how, as I said before, people do as I say, not as I do, how people behave, and most people don't think about their own disabilities. All of you who have eyesight, and I've said it several times on this podcast, have a disability as well. You're light dependent. Just wait till the power goes out in the building and you got to go off and try to scrounge for a flashlight or a smartphone.
Yeah.
The thing is that because so many people think that eyesight is really the only game in town, our society collectively has worked really hard to make light on demand a fact of life everywhere. And so we've spent basically 145 years developing this technology to make light on demand available pretty much in a ubiquitous sort of way. So most of the time you have light on demand until you don't. Like when I was in a hotel in March, and I've seen it other times since and before, be in a building and suddenly the power goes out and people start to scream and they don't know what to do. And the fear comes in and I'm sitting there going, so what's the problem? The issue is you guys are light dependent. And the reality is disability should not mean a lack of ability because it's not. Right. Disability is a characteristic that every single person on the planet has. And what we need to truly understand and do is to recognize that the characteristic manifests itself in different ways for different people. It doesn't mean it's not there. So let light cover up your disability, but you still have it. And you can say all day long you don't, but you do. But we're too arrogant sometimes to really address that and deal with it. And it's so unfortunate when that happens so much in our world today.
Yeah.
But the fact is that's the way it is. And so I talk about it probably more than some people would like on the podcast because I want the message to be heard by everyone that disability does not mean lack of ability, and everyone has that characteristic in one way or another. For my part,
yep.
Go ahead.
No. I was going to say absolutely. And I loved hearing you talk about it on the podcasts that I listened to and the speeches that I listened to, because disabled individuals are among some of the most discriminated individuals in this country and this planet. And when you were talking about what happened to you as a child in terms of what the doctors told your parents, a lot of people don't realize that in this country, till as recently as 1979, they were sterilizing women to keep certain women from being able to reproduce because it would pollute the gene pool with disability characteristics.
And there were courts who backed that up.
Yes.
And supported eugenics like that.
Yes, exactly. And so, depending on it, had I been born in a different state, God knows what would have happened.
Yeah.
But, in California was one of the biggest ones. And, a lot of people don't know that because we don't talk about those parts of our history. But whether I was paying attention, I'm really good at listening, and I would realize that it's naturally human beings tend to want to group things. They all want to be seen as individuals, but they want to put everybody else in groups. And you could say, people talk about, different immigrants being stupid. I'm sorry, how many languages do you speak? Because they may be struggling in English, but most most people I know who have immigrated here know at least one, if not 5 or 6. My Spanish is terrible. God, I went to Mexico, for my honeymoon. I mean, people who, all these diverse people, we are all wonderfully and perfectly made. Depending on whether or not you believe in God, we're wonderfully and perfectly made in God's image.
Yeah.
And if the Bible says God makes no mistakes, who are we to think that anyone else is any less, more superior, less superior, or that we're more superior than anyone else?
Well, except that in Oh God, George Burns said that he made a mistake because he made avocado pits too large.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Had to sneak that one in.
I remember that, which is funny though.
Only George. But I hear exactly what you're saying. The fact of the matter is, and kids especially, I was talking with someone earlier today, and we were doing another interview, and we were talking about children and growing up and how kids are fun loving. They are full of adventure, and they don't have all of these agendas. And it's so unfortunate that we teach this in so many ways to children, and they grow up with these horrible attitudes to a large degree, and there's no need for it. Children aren't evil, but we make them that way.
Well, we could say that about a lot of things, right? I mean, a thing is a thing. It's how we use it.
It is.
Children are born a blank slate. It's what we write on it.
That's right.
And the younger we can undo that, the better. And which is a huge part of, like I said, my third pivot was my most recent pivot after going to grad school, because I was determined I was going to get that master's degree before I turned 50. And then getting long COVID, I was like, okay, you're still here. What are you going to do with this?
Yeah. And
I said, well, since grad school, I've been talking about, because here I am, this Black female who's been, the first Black female here, the first Black female there, because I was lighter skinned. I was palpable, which gets into a whole other issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't, quote unquote, sound Black, or growing up, the Black kids would say, your family talks white. Well, half of my family is white. All my cousins are all interracial. That was my way my dad's family was.
And
we were every possible shade. So it was just normal to me. But then in the post-Obama era, it was a little bit more normalized.
For a while.
Yeah. Oh, if I had $1 for every time somebody said, oh, she speaks so well, I'd be very, very rich. But
if I had $1 for every time somebody said, you're amazing. And of course, what they're really saying is, especially for a blind person, yes. I hear you.
Mm-hmm. And so after getting COVID and realizing I was still here, and seeing the spotlight shine on all things that were broken with our healthcare system, and then some, for anybody who was a person of color, who had an existing disability. Some of the things that I experienced, I actually had to, I was like, Mom, you deal with the hospital. You're a nursing professor. You're Caucasian. They're not listening to me. You just deal with it, because they're not listening to me. Because as so many of us continue to have to deal with ongoing symptoms before anybody would acknowledge that that was a real thing, and so many people who are in the disability community were right in there with us. We're all in there together, finding each other in social media and Facebook groups, because no one would listen to us.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I was like, okay, you're still here. You're here for a reason. It's time to get vocal about everything that's broken in this country, about how we treat each other in general. And as the person of color in many organizations back when it was still called affirmative action, and having been part of integrating teams in corporate and government agencies and seeing the narrative shift, over the years, I was already getting concerned. And then when everybody was exposed to what so many of us knew in the death of George Floyd and others, while everybody else said, okay, stand up. This is a time for celebration. People are finally going to learn. Change is going to happen. Companies are issuing pledges everywhere. We're finally going to get the change that's been coming. And me, I'm on a webinar, still in very deep throes of long COVID with massive cognitive issues. And I said, here's my concern. And I meant to say backlash. I said, the blacklash is coming. And they said, and that stuck. I said, give it time. People know when things aren't authentic. People know when change is being shoved down their throat. People don't like being told that they're responsible for things that they didn't have happen, and saying, now you know how it feels to be me is not the right response for that. And people started reading books about anti-racism and all these things. I said, I'm telling you. And then I repeated, I said, I'm going to keep using that word. The blacklash is coming. I said it in 2021 on record in a webinar. And now we have what we're seeing in Florida and other states, and book burnings and Supreme Court decisions, in all of these things as the pendulum swings back from one side to the other. And companies are eliminating diversity, equity, inclusion programs, and people are leaving this fairly new kind of, I guess, practice, for lack of better words. I mean, it's been slowly evolving from diversity, inclusion, diversity, equity. And I've been saying for 8 years, we're doing it all wrong. We're doing it all wrong. At no point in over 20 years have I ever brought a new hire into a situation without first addressing what needed to be addressed in-house to create the environment that would make it possible for them to succeed. We should be doing it differently. And then, of course, after my assault, I was like, we have a serious civility issue. Just in terms, I mean, you can only legislate how people treat each other so much, but we have serious civility issues going on in workplaces that aren't being addressed for all of the wrong reasons across different groups. And it's time that we get our houses in order in terms of civility, then focus on creating the inclusive environment that it should be, then look at the equity issues within that environment. Then you bring in the diversity hires that you want to bring in to help your company capitalize on the 30% return on investment that most companies that are diverse actually experience when they are run properly in a truly, culture add way. And then everybody can succeed. Otherwise, they're just hiring somebody. That person comes in, they can't function, they quit. Everybody throws up their hands and says, oh, well, we tried, it didn't work, move on.
Tell me about purpose-filled solutions and evolutions, if you would.
Sure. So purpose-filled solutions and evolutions, while I was in grad school, and I've been doing coaching internally and externally since 1997. And I was asked in grad school as part of one of my classes to come up with a 2 or 3 word way to describe what I am from a professional standpoint. And I described myself as a resource navigator. And because so many of my roles involved either giving the answers or pointing people into the direction where they could find the answers. And so I had been doing everything that you're not supposed to do as a side hustle. And here I am with long COVID. I go ahead, I finally get my International Coaching Federation certification that I've been putting off for 12 years. And my coach says, when are you going to start a business? You've helped like thousands of others. When are you going to actually do it yourself? And I figured, okay. So purpose-filled solutions and evolutions was originally going to be purpose-filled solutions and evolutions navigators, but I've refiled the service mark to drop the navigators, even though I still use it. Solutions navigator was already taken. So I was like, well, everything I do is coaching around the purpose. Mm-hmm. What's your why? What is your core purpose? I know mine. Mine is helping others figure out theirs and then achieve it. And after about 3 weeks of analysis paralysis, I finally settled on purpose-filled solutions and evolutions, a company that would offer the coaching that I had been doing, but also capitalize on my years of experience in various leadership roles, from supervisor up to executive director, as well as my master's of science in executive leadership and all that I had learned in grad school, with a big focus on fixing what I felt was broken with what I call civility, inclusion, equity, and diversity. And my company turned 2 in June, and I have a team of consultants that support me, and a young woman that I hired from a program that I served as a leadership coach in, Braven. Shout out to Braven, which is a fellowship program for college students. I brought her in as an intern and then hired her as my team. And she was a young woman who came here at the age of 3 as part of her parents trying to escape Mexico. And she's DACA, and she's going through the citizenship process. And she couldn't find a job in the DEI space. And so after a number of meetings, I asked her, I apologize for the barking. After a number of meetings, I asked her, okay, we've had all these conversations about what I feel is wrong with DEI. Take the information and take the sorry about that. Take all of the information that I gave you, and then I want you to go and I want you to research and I want you to come back and tell me how you would redo my inclusion, equity, and diversity program. And she came back and she said, I think we need to start with mental health and physical disabilities. So this young woman, who herself was an immigrant, who was given carte blanche to look at everything that we should be looking at as part of a program that focuses on inclusion, equity, and diversity, had every reason to, throughout her life, to come back with any number of options. And that's what she came back with. And I said, okay, would you like a job as a consultant? And how would you like to help me take the lead on developing this program? And that's how Paving the Way to Civility, Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity was born. Wow.
Well, that is pretty cool. And you're even making enough to pay her and everything, huh?
I am.
That's a blessing.
Unfortunately, it works out. She's a part-time consultant. Her and her husband just had their second baby. And so she's on maternity leave right now. But we did our first official full public offering of the program in June. It was very well received. People were blown away. They learned things, of course, that they were never taught. Mm-hmm. And about everything from how the messages are even being manipulated to, why it's so important to see every person as an individual being. And someone who I love, Lewis Brown's Griggs, was the one who I stole the spelling of it from, because I would always say people want to be human beings, and he would always capitalize the BE in being. Mm-hmm. And so Paving the Way to Civility, Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity, a new way of being in workplace and in life, is our most comprehensive flagship training program.
Who have been some of the people who've had the most influence on you as you're going through life?
My mom obviously has been one. I mentioned a couple, Lisa Hillerin, who stood by me when she had everything to risk. I have 2 ride or die best friends. One, unfortunately, Kathy Jaggard passed. Actually, it'll be a year next week. She was also a rape survivor, and we met when I was 19. She was a little bit older. She was 32, but we bonded, and she was my best friend and mentor in so many different ways. She was the reason I went to work at Prudential. We went through all kinds of things together. And, I referred to her as one of the greatest loves of my life. And the other one, her name is Maria O'Callahan Cassidy, who she relocated to an amazing new position at Richmond University only weeks before Kathy passed. So I fortunately didn't lose Maria. It's hard because she's not here, but these are both people that I've known since my teens and have definitely shaped who I am. My son, actually, I've learned so much from him. My son is neurodiverse. He likes to say he's not on the spectrum. He broke the spectrum.
Wow, that's good.
And he is hysterical and funny and incredibly talented and incredibly brilliant, and helping navigate the public schools where we live, and watching him continue to still get back up even when he was pushed down, because in our school district, if you are not in the box, you are basically out of luck. So we had to get an attorney for our son when he was only in third grade, to fight for his rights. And but he knows himself, and really his biggest challenge is he has something called dysgraphia. He can recite things verbatim, but you could give him that same thing to copy, and he struggles to copy it. And that was a very difficult educational experience for him. But now he's a mechanic. He's training to be a mechanic. He wants to own his own mechanic shop. He has a lovely girlfriend. Colin's girlfriend is Ariel. They've been together since they were 14 and 16, and now they are 19 and 21, going on 20 and 22. And she is the daughter I would have chosen. I call her the daughter I got to choose. And I've learned so much because a lot of her upbringing is very similar to mine. They say we're very careful to make sure it doesn't get weird. But they say you end up with somebody very similar to your parent. Ariel and I definitely have a lot in common. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say my husband, because even though we definitely have our different political beliefs, he has really just unleashed me. One thing he stands very firm on is equal pay for women, after watching some of the experiences that I go through. And he is constantly, oh, go do it. You got to do this. You got to speak up. Oh, you've been offered a show. I should mention Jo Colantonio, my coach. She is the one who did push me off the cliff to get my show by saying, I'm booking you on a local talk show so that you have 2 weeks. You have a couple of weeks to get ready to go announce your business is finally open. That's the other reason why Purpose-Filled Solutions and Evolutions came in. But these are some really all unique but very interesting teachers in my life.
So tell me really quickly, if you would, about your talk show. My
talk show was an offshoot of Jo pushing me off the cliff. Ironically, and we joke because Jo is my husband, but Jo is my coach and also probably one of my closest friends at this point.
Two Joes.
And two Joes. One's J-O-E, one's J-O. And J-O booked me on this talk show called Morning Coffee and gave me a couple of weeks. She said, I know you can incorporate a business within 72 hours. I've seen you do it. You're going to do it. And so sure enough, on July 2nd of 2021, I went in there. My business was 2 weeks old, and I announced and introduced myself and my one intern to the world, somebody else, my son's girlfriend, and told them about what I was looking to do and how I was going to change the world, and the narrative, and be a coach and offer services that I couldn't offer in my day job. And they came back to me and said, the response to your episode was so amazing. Do you want to do a show? I was like, I've always been the person on answering the questions or writing for government officials who are answering the questions. I've never been on that side of the mic. And they said, well, what do you think? I said, let me think about it. And I was originally going to call my blog, What the Why? kind of like instead of WTF, WTW. And I said, I have an idea. If you give me full control over who my guests are, would you be interested in doing a show called What the Why? And it would be conversations with diverse leaders from all walks of life, all races, genders, disabilities, ages. And I would interview them about what their purpose in life was and how they figured it out. And the station manager said, yeah, let's do it. And so right now I'm on a brief hiatus because the station's in the middle of a move, but I'm in my second season of What the Why with Barbara Anne. And I'm hoping to have you on in my third season because you are so freaking awesome. And not because you're blind. You're just freaking awesome. Period.
Listen to you.
Just amazing. Completely and utterly amazing. But I have interviewed the smallest of businesses. My oldest guests have been in their 80s. My youngest recently was 8. He is he's a math genius who video of him doing complex math at the age of 3 went viral. He was invited to join Mensa at 4. His mom submitted it and he was accepted at age 5. He and she both have long COVID. So Cynthia, shout out to Cynthia Adnig and her brilliant son, Aiden. They're both brilliant. And she founded a health equity agency. And he is officially the pediatric spokesperson. He does not know his IQ. So cute. He had literally just turned 8 a couple weeks before I interviewed him in August. And 1 second, he's telling me what I need to understand about quantum singularities. And then the next second, he's holding up pieces of clay saying, look at the ribbon I made. And what's funny about the interview we did is all 3 of us were having a level of a COVID flare up. So all 3 of us were having cognitive challenges. So
it must have been a fun show.
It was fun. But, when you're with an 8-year-old, you roll with it.
Yep. You do.
And we just kind of laugh with it. But he's amazing. He's training to be a chess champion because COVID has affected his ability to do outdoor sports. And he's homeschooled with a pod of other little young geniuses like him. And, I got to talk with one of the people I got to interview was the biker from the Village People. And the first woman to be the president of the National Association of Government Guaranteed Lenders and, some local elected officials. But then I found out a whole side to my hairdresser and his story as a small business owner who's getting ready to hand it off to his daughter now that he's in his 60s and what his journey was like and how his grandparents stood behind him as a Black straight male wanting to do hair.
There you go. So you had lots of people. I have one more question for you. This is a very crucial question. How tall are you?
5'6".
And how tall is your husband?
5'8".
We did not follow in our parents' footsteps okay. I just wanted to check that out.
But here's the flip side to that though.
Yeah.
They were both named Joe. My dad was a Joseph. My husband is a Joseph.
There you go. And what's your son's name?
Colin.
Well, that's right. Joseph. You said that. Yeah. Well, Colin right. Joseph. Okay. Yeah. So there's a Joseph in there.
And all of them, my dad was rather dark for a mixed race man. Yeah. All 3 of them are avid outdoor. And my husband's not into the same kind of football, basketball my dad was. But all 3 of them were hunters.
Okay.
Married to the former vegetarian. Yeah.
There you are. If people want to reach out to you, maybe learn about your coaching and get in touch, how do they do that?
They can find me on LinkedIn at B Gardenhire-Mills. And
can you spell?
Sure. It's BGARDENHIRE Mills. I'm on all forms of social media. And honestly, if they can get Barbara Anne Gardenhire-Mills, if you Google that and What the Why, it pops up. The show airs on RVN RVNtelevision.com as well as Roku. And then I believe I forwarded you some other links
You
to our
did.
website. I'm not going to spell out our whole ridiculously long website because
that's okay.
I actually bought the URLs to shorten it.
So how do I find it on Roku?
I believe RVN, because I don't have Roku. That's why I said it.
Yeah,
But if you go on Roku, you should be able to find the channel for RVN Television.
It must be on the Roku channels. All right, I'll check it out.
Under the Roku channels. Otherwise,
I will find
RVN Television, or there's access to it directly from my website, which is my entire name spelled out. A moment of weakness when I was having COVID happy hypoxia, which is really not happy, but I thought somebody said to me, "Oh, why don't you just name your website your company?" And I thought, "Oh, sure."
Yeah, well,
as if my name isn't long enough. Purpose-Filled Solutions and Evolutions, because you can't have an ampersand in a website.
Right. No, that's okay.
Really long, so
I'm going to go hunt it down on Roku, though. That'll be kind of fun.
Awesome.
Well, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank you for listening. Love to hear your thoughts about today. This has been a lot of fun, and Barbara Ann's life and lessons are definitely worth paying attention to, and I really value the time that we got to spend. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to email me, Michael H.I., MICHAELHI at Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com, or go to www.michaelhingson, HINGSON.com/podcast to listen to more podcasts. But you can also find us wherever podcasts can be found. And wherever you listen, please give us a 5-star rating. We appreciate it. We appreciate your insights and your comments and value them greatly. Of course, both Barbara Anne, for you and for you listening, if you know of anyone who ought to be a guest on our podcast, please let us know. We're always looking for more people to come on our podcast. I'm sure that Barbara Anne could talk to you about talk shows and finding guests. So whatever, we'd love to hear from you, and we really value your time and that you took the time to be with us today. And Barbara Anne, one last time, thank you very much for being here with us.
It's truly been an honor. Thank you so much for inviting me on.